news coming from United Nations about India, maybe by the middle of this year, crossing China and becoming the largest population country, is definitely a talking point. But it's not going to completely change either the internal situation or equations between China and India. It really follows the trends that we have seen earlier, that prosperity in any country leads to slowing down of birth rates, increasing of longevity. Same thing is happening in China. And sooner or later, same thing will happen in India. Indeed, the growth rate of population both in China and India has over time begun to slow down, except that India's growth rate is slowing down little slower than China. So, in that sense, it is going to happen in both China and India. And of course, it does create a certain sense of both enthusiasm and responsibility as to when the workforce in India will cross the total workforce of China, what India wants to do with that workforce and how to use that demographic dividend, as we call it. Important thing to understand is that India may not really replicate and need not replicate China's success story of last 40 years, because when China started to open up and reform, that was the time when manufacturing sector was the driver of growth rates and GDPs around the world. And of course, China made best of it. And today, China produces almost 30% of global manufacturing. But world is now moving towards services sector driven by information technology related services. So India will have to increase the skill and capacity of this young workforce in that direction. So basically, it brings both a great opportunity but also responsibility as to how to use that enormous demographic dividend that India may have. But I don't think this should be seen as a kind of a sudden change. This was a change in anticipation, and it's also a slow-moving change, which is going to continue over a period of time. So nothing in a kind of a quick, shift between either the bilateral relations or the demographics in China and India. But definitely, I think India has now a younger workforce of a larger size.
Yeah.
And India has to really take care of how to empower them to be more productive.
So let's look. What is your reaction? Do you agree with Professor Gong's assessment that it's not necessarily the quantity, the number, but the quality of the workforce that really makes the difference? What is your take?
As he mentioned earlier, all the developed countries have undergone this process of shrinking of population, but they have continued to be robust and powerful economies. So productivity, yes, has certain amount of link to the number of workforce that each nation has, but the productivity of that workforce also depends on how skilled and how productive they are, in which case technology does play an important role. And in that sense, I think other than just infusion of technology within the workforce, of course, the whole world knows China also has an impressive record of women employment and women empowerment and women being productive. In fact, more than the global average, Chinese women have been participating in being productive for the global for the Chinese GDP. India, in that sense, has to also focus on educating and providing skills to women workforce to bring that potential into use. And likewise, I think one can also see as to what particular parts of each country, for example, in China, the northeastern provinces have been normally seeing outflow of populations to the eastern flank, where GDP in Zhejiang, in Shanghai and Guangdong was growing much faster. Likewise, in India, for example, in India, the population growth rates in south of India are slower than population growth rates in north, whereas the skill and education is usually seen as better in south of India. So some of these internal details of various components, segments of population will have to provide a feed into the how policies are to be made and how policies will be implemented, fundamentally to ensure that both China and India continue to be productive, because put together, they are virtually 40% of global population. So if these two countries are taking care of their citizens, they are automatically taking care of 40% of global population. And of course, it has spin-offs to the other global GDPs also. India today is the fastest growing leading economy already. And now is that opportunity here where the workforce is expanding and there is a greater opportunity to take it forward.
What is your take? Because it's nice to have a big family, to have a lot of people, to have a lot of young people, so you potentially have a huge workforce, but it also takes a lot of resources to feed these people. They consume a lot of resources. As we know, the Earth is experiencing crises in terms of resources and pollution, and you also have to provide education, healthcare to all of these people. So it's not just about the numbers. And is it a curse or a blessing, really, for countries such as India? And there are other countries in Africa, for instance, whose population is growing very rapidly as well. So, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Is India ready and able to cope with that challenge?
Liu Xin, first of all, I think governments can influence demographic trends to some extent. But demographies are not matter of choices that can be, sort of easily influenced. And therefore, first of all, it is now very much on expected lines that China's population has begun to shrink because of a level of development that China has reached. And as I mentioned initially, yes, it could happen in India also. But demographic dividend is something which is, understood around the world. And you mentioned Africa. It is because of demographics that Africa is today seen as a continent of the future, where both consumption and production is going to shift in terms of global trends and how the world will be moving. And I think China is majorly involved in several African countries with that understanding that that is where the growth rates are going to happen. What? Yes. Now, it comes both with the opportunities and challenges. Now, if there's a large workforce, it has to be given opportunities to be productive. And providing employment could be one way of it, but also facilitating and creating opportunities for entrepreneurs to create more opportunities. And it's not just the state. Perhaps to some extent, China, particularly in the past, had stayed providing for most of the employment for their own workforce. But that's not how it works in India. There are very powerful private enterprises, small level enterprises, mid-sized enterprises that also create employment. But fundamentally, I think why this is called demographic dividend is that workforce, particularly when it is young, is going to be really productive. States can create more opportunities for them, make them more productive, channelize them in the right direction, or let them do the way they want, but they will still be productive. Younger people have their whole life ahead and they want to do something in life.
Is the Indian government ready and able to provide the kind of education opportunities, for instance, before the workforce becomes productive? They need to be trained, they need to be educated, they need to be taken care of. The infant mortality, for instance, need to be kept down. So is India taking these measures seriously and taking these measures to really benefit the growing population?
Without doubt, India, as I said, the demographic shift is not something that comes as a news to any country. So India has been fully aware of that kind of demographic change in the offing, and therefore several initiatives have been made in the past. We have now a special ministry for skill development, which focuses on creating that kind of opportunity for younger people to train them better. We also, of course, have a very large Ministry of Education. Healthcare is one of the very important missions of Indian Prime Minister, which wants to focus on using all kinds of assets that India has in terms of ancient medicine to more well-being of people, using all kinds of traditions of medicine. And in that sense, yes, there has been enormous amount of effort being made at the government level, but government is also encouraging people to find their own resources and find their own opportunities and facilitate that by creating infrastructure, by creating laws, by creating mechanisms where people can be basically more productive. Now, whether those policies are all going to be 100% success, that of course we will know in future only.
Okay. Yeah.